I am so excited to welcome Dr. Roselle Gonsalves. There are a couple of reasons I'm excited. First, on a personal level, I met Roselle 2 years ago when I was on a journey of publishing my first book, Landed. And I remember just how instantly we connected on the power of storytelling. Professionally, I know that Roselle is the head of inclusion and reconciliation at ATB Financial, where she heads up strategic initiatives to weave equity, inclusion, and socioeconomic reconciliation with Indigenous communities. But there's more, much more. Folks, believe me when I say this, Roselle is a force to contend with. She also holds a master's degree from the University of Toronto in Gender and Sexual Diversity Studies and Religious Studies. And she earned her PhD at the University of Calgary in the ethnographic study of transnational immigrant identity, Canadian multiculturalism, and intersectionality. Roselle also currently serves on the board of governors at Curling Canada, representing Canada at the World Curling Federation, and she sits on the Global DEI Council at the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship. And if that weren't enough, Roselle was just named one of Edmonton's top 40 under 40 and published her book last year called The Ordinary Turned Precious. So, Roselle, I have to admit, I am so impressed. I said this to you when we first met, and I also remember our conversation where I kind of, I think, gently nudged you around, why aren't you writing a book yet? And so, sure enough, you published a book last year, your memoir, and I can't wait to talk to you about it because it truly has touched me at a deep level. But before we do that, I kind of want to turn it over to you, and I want our listeners to get to know the Roselle beyond the formal bio that I just shared. So I wonder if you could start with your story of who is Roselle?
Wow. Well, thank you, Gayathri, for having me on this conversation. I am deeply honored, humbled, and just feel like this is the conversation that I've been waiting to have because you very poetically bookend my story of being a first-time author. I must acknowledge that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq people. I make my home in a place called Porter's Lake, just outside of Halifax, and this is a new development in my life because I, through the writing of the book, recognized a deep yearning to return back to living by the ocean, which is where I grew up. And so that's where I'll start my story. I was born and raised by the ocean. I grew up in a city called Mumbai now. When I was growing up, it was called Bombay. And I lived there with, people who looked like me, sounded like me. We lived in a small community that was shaped by the religious minority community that we were a part of in the next street over from the shipping or the fishing village that my grandmother and her community of fisher folks belonged to. So I have deep, deep roots that go on ancestrally, indigenously in the part of the world that I was fortunate enough to be born and raised in. And I don't take that for granted, that rooting and that early sense of knowing where I come from, whom I belong to, certainly has shaped my understanding of myself and how I see myself in the world. When I was 13, like many folks from the subcontinent in the 80s and 90s chose to expand where we'd like to live, and my parents made the decision to immigrate to Canada. I was 13 and moved just outside of Toronto, and that's where I grew up. I spent my adolescent and teenage years there. Moved to downtown Toronto proper for my education, and then in 2010 had the opportunity to move to Calgary, and for 14 years lived in Alberta and made my life kind of with the Rocky Mountains and understanding and knowing a place that is so different from all of the places that I knew before. And then as life happens, even though I am a homebody and a nester by nature, I have once again moved, like I mentioned, now to Nova Scotia, and hopefully this is sort of the final move of this is my forever home. But so to answer the question of who I am, I do tell the stories of where I'm from because in many ways those places shaped me and have created for me a sense of belonging and a sense of who I am with the land, the people of the land, being in gratitude for all of the gifts that has created for an understanding of myself. I like the word multitudinal because we are never just one thing. To have added author to my identity in this last year feels a little surreal, feels a little beyond my comprehension. But I think that I have always been a storyteller. I've always been a person that communicates through anecdotes, through, even my doctorate work was all qualitative data collection. It was listening to the stories and histories of people, because for me, fundamentally, as a storyteller, I believe that we live the longest in the minds and hearts of the people who tell our stories. And, I love the phrase that we live as long as the last person that tells our story, right?
Mm,
I believe there's a
so
version of
beautiful.
you and I that lives in each other. I believe that there's a version of you and I that lives in every person that's read our work and our books and come in contact with us. And not all those versions of ourselves are actually recognizable to us. And not all those versions of ourselves are
Mm,
actually the best versions of ourselves, we'll say. And I also actually firmly believe that the act of storytelling allows us to be reflective, both reflective on our
mm,
journey as people, but also reflective of what about you, Gayatri, do I see in myself? And it's in this way that empathetic bridge gets built. And so that's another part of my identity that I hold very sincerely, is my ability, skill, but also natural way of being, which is a bridge builder, connecting to places, to people, to thoughts, to ideas, to ways of being, because I have not always had certainty. I've not always been from one place or another. I've always had to understand how the bridging between those two things creates a richer understanding. And so, being that bridge builder, and the how of how I do that is storytelling. So all of that is wrapped up. I know that's a complex and nebulous answer, but that's who I see myself as. And sometimes, the bio that you read feels a little bit surreal and removed, because it is the highlight reel of
mm,
a life that for me has always been values based, has always been carved it to suit who I am as a human being. And I've had the great fortune of finding spaces, advocates, champions, and opportunities where that has found meaning. And I'm using massive air quotes here, but success in what our world deems as successful. But for me, that bio is one very unidimensional story, because to me, success is if I've impacted the world around me in a meaningful and positive way, whether it's in my relationships, in how I leave the world better than I found it, and that I leave folks whom I interact with feeling a sense of their own value, because I believe that we are stronger when we know each other's value together.
absolutely. Oh, Roselle, that was not just, I mean, more than a bio, but a wonderful place of how you started to share your story with, to, as you said, in order to reflect who we are, it starts with where we come from. And congratulations, by the way, for making that decision to move back to, or move closer to the ocean. I totally hear you. I also grew up in a place which was next to the ocean, and there's something about that, right? That I love the mountains. I love where I am now, but I do miss the ocean. And so that's so beautiful that you started from that place of where you come from. And so this is something I know that you share quite a bit of in your book, and not to give away too much of your story for the listeners, because I do want them to check out your book. But as I started reading it, to your point earlier of seeing yourself reflected in those stories, I definitely felt that. Roselle, I think you are an amazing storyteller. I mean, we could just see it right now, but even through the words that you share in your book, I saw pieces of myself reflected. And I started to actually take some notes, and I want to read back a few lines to you that really stood out to me. And then I just wanted to get your take on that. So one of the lines was, "It is courageous to reveal myself, and it is revolutionary to have someone bear witness to my fullness and not run away." Ooh, and I love this because I think it really speaks to the power of storytelling, but also the power of vulnerability. Can you share a little bit more about what that meant to you writing that?
Hmm. Yes. I mean, vulnerability is such a loaded, fascinating, complex word and concept. When I was writing that book, um, one of the things that had become abundantly clear as I, even entertained the idea of writing it was that I was going to have to expose myself, right? This idea of overexposure. And, Gayatri, even up to the day before the book was supposed to be published, I sat in bed, I couldn't sleep that night, and I was like, holy smokes, Roselle, what have you done? Right? You've opened the curtains wide open, and now what, right? That fear of the unknown, of the uncertain, of being judged, of judging yourself, of judging myself. And so let me take you back to, when I first said, okay, I think, and this was to your encouragement. You'd said to me, Roselle, I think you need to write. You need to write this down. And, created for me just that deep external validation that sometimes we need when we don't always know our certainty within. And I said, okay, I'm going to try this and write it down. But I like knowing why I'm doing something. I like knowing what my reasons are because, I like the air quotes I put in around success earlier. When people think about writing a book, they think that the success is the publishing of that book and the book is going to come out and that's the end.
Mhm.
That's the success story. And that is one measure of success, but it wasn't going to be my measure of success because I didn't that to me felt okay. I can write something, but it could also just be garbage. It could be hot garbage and I could put it out in the world and that's the end of that success achieved. So I wrote down what were my whys, what were my reasons for wanting to engage on this journey, and they were twofold. My first reason was because I would like to shine light, sunshine, on the parts of my story that, for a number of different reasons, have remained untold, unexplored, unseen, unheard for my first, 4 decades of life. Whether that's because
Mhm.
many of us are taught to be ashamed of our life stories, many of us are told, in Hindi, there's a phrase, log kya kahenge, like what are people going to say if
Mhm.
they know that story, what the judgment that will come from that. So I wanted to shine a light on my own story, if even just for myself, even just to be authentic and vulnerable internally. And the second why was so that I could be one voice amongst many that people could read and perhaps recognize themselves, like you said you did, within the words and the experiences. No other person, whether they're my family member, even if they were my
Mhm.
identical twin, is going to have written the same book. They will not have had the same experience, the same lives, even the same perception or receiving of those experiences. We're all different, we're all unique. But for me, the power of storytelling is that every so often you recognize yourself in someone else's words. And the gift that you have given me, Gayatri, is to say that you saw yourself within my words. That was my second why, is so that other people could see themselves more clearly. And that has been the most profound gift I have received since the book came out 3 or 4 months ago, is people from every walk of life,
Mhm.
every part of the globe have messaged to say, I saw myself in your story. I didn't think I would. I sat to read this because I know you and I wanted to learn more about you, but instead I also learned a little bit more about me. And that, I think, is where vulnerability for me comes in, because oftentimes we think about vulnerability as this overexposure of our wounds or an overexposure of our story without a recognition that in order for us to be vulnerable, in order for us to face the parts that make us feel vulnerable, we actually have to be willing to be vulnerable with ourselves first, be
Mhm.
willing to honor our stories, and what they have meant for us, whether good or bad or ugly, internally, so that we might cultivate safety for ourselves within, and then cultivate the relationships within which we are psychologically safe to be vulnerable around us. So whether it's with, a good friend, whether it's with a partner, whether it's with someone in your workplace, that vulnerability can only happen when you feel a sense of safety within. And that's going to take a multitude of different ways of for different people. But that to me is really the essence of the book, is there is power in knowing my own story, standing in my own truth. Because then when I choose to let somebody else in, and they see me for who I truly am in this world and recognize that, what a beautiful gift to receive in relationship with one another. And also, what a gift to give not just your current self, but also perhaps the past versions of you that remained unseen, unheard, and unrecognized.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's absolutely giving a gift to yourself, to your past self, to the people around you who feel seen and reflected through your story. It was a gift reading your words, Roselle. And this idea of exposure, I feel like that's something that I also quite often see in my work. And, in this process that I teach guided autobiography, there's a piece of it that's around writing first for yourself, which is about self-reflection, like you talked about, right? It's owning our own narrative so that the narrative ceases to own us. And I think that's such a powerful shift that happens that is all about that safety that you talked about, right? Is allowing ourselves to be vulnerable to ourselves and owning our own story. And through that expression, I think we also get to heal sometimes even. I'm going to use the word heal because we see sort of things that have happened that we might have wrestled with in the moment, but now looking back, we get some kind of a closure, or we get a deeper understanding of what it is that struggle was going in through our lives at that time. But then I think what you're talking about is that transition that happens to when you're now writing for an audience, right? And now there's that translation that sort of happens between this is what I'm comfortable with, the safety of creating in myself and the self-reflection I've done for myself, and this is what I'm comfortable with actually sharing with the world. So can you talk me through a little bit of your process of how you did that? Because I find that even in my work, a lot of people get stuck in just figuring out like what parts of my story do I actually share, because they may be worried about how it's received, and what if they're not seen or not valued through expressing their story, or what if someone takes offense to it, or just uses it in a way that kind of backfires on that person. So what was your process like?
Yeah, and those are real, real fears and concerns. And that's where I talk about psychological safety, right? So for me, the process, first and foremost, was I've always been a writer. So I've always processed my thoughts and fears and insecurities and life happenings through journaling, through blogging, through whatever medium of writing. And, since I could remember, I think got my first journal 5, 6 years old because I watched a TV show where somebody had a diary. I think it was like Babysitter's Club or something, right? And I thought, oh, I want a diary. I want to write about, what's happening in my world. And so it's always been writing as the medium for me to express myself. So one is that I stayed true to the medium that felt most natural to me. I think it would be a disservice to that voice to say, okay, well, now go put on, a dance production that interprets these life experiences, or put on a painting that, because that's not true to how I express myself. So one is that I had to acknowledge where I was most comfortable sharing my voice, or how I was most comfortable sharing my voice. Then for the first almost, 3 or 4 months, because I knew I wanted to write and I was feeling this fountain kind of coming out of me, I just wrote without agenda, without parameters, without who is going to read this or what are they going to think. Much of it was catharsis. Much of it was written in this stream of consciousness moment that I just needed to get it out on the page, right? Whether it's a story, whether it's like I didn't have things like dialogue. I didn't have things like, I wrote down the words I could remember in the ways that I could remember them. And the beautiful thing for me about writing is that the more I write, the more it actually catalyzes for me memories and things that I might have forgotten, or things that I might have repressed, or things that I'm no longer holding sort of in the front of house of my brain, right? Oh yeah, remember this time? Let's write that down too, right? And so just wrote in abundance. And then I thought, okay, and I worked with a coach. We've worked with similar folks in our writing journeys. I worked with a coach, and then she said, okay, now you've done all of the words on the paper. Now, what is the story that you want to tell? Who is the audience? Think of the person that you want to address. Think of the shape of the narrative, and there's tools and resources, and the workshops that you lead, the expertise that you bring to the art of storytelling, those tools are really powerful to be able to guide that process. But because I had gotten all of my words out on paper, I had an abundance of information and sort of a body of work that I could then pull in. Okay, I want to tell this story. I'm going to tell it in this way. I'm going to shape it. And then the author, me, the author, became the architect. And so there's power in that as well, to be able to take for what for many moments was painful regurgitation of my story, take that pain and find power in shaping it to be able to tell the story effectively. You use the word healing, and I will contribute an additional word to that process, which is meaning making. We as human beings find value in our brain when things, you'd said closure, find that healing. I love the language of meaning making because healing is not a linear process. It's not a one and done that you'll get there. Sometimes those wounds persist throughout our lifetime, but when we attach meaning to them, when we attach what our growth has been through them, we can find a way through that wound so that we can understand the lessons of that wound. And to that, I will say, if you have a copy of my book, or if you get a copy of my book, you'll notice that on the cover, very intentionally designed, I wanted to put in the Japanese art form of kintsugi, which is the filling of the cracks in broken pottery with gold. This idea that you find something precious even in something that is broken. Those two things are not mutually exclusive from each other. This idea that we can both have experienced hardship and we can make something really powerful, beautiful, and precious through the journey of understanding.
Oh, your cover design, by the way, I can't even find the word to describe it. It embodies that idea of holding multiple truths. And I think that's what you're talking about, right? Is our ability to hold multiple truths. But something that you said, Roselle, that also really resonates for me is this idea of just allowing that stream of consciousness to help you figure out what is it that you want to actually write about, and just letting yourself write, and then having that abundance of information to go back to and go, okay, what is it that I actually want to convey or help land with someone? And so I'm curious, Roselle, through that process, if at any point you ever wondered if the people who might be reading your book could be, people your family, your friends, could be coworkers, and if there was ever sort of a worry that you had about how they may receive it. Because I think sometimes what happens is when we put our stories out in the world, and I've seen this through my public publishing landed, it's different when the feedback comes from someone who is a total stranger, and it's great if it's great feedback or not, but it's different when it's someone that you know, and so how they may perceive it. Was there any concern like that came up for you?
Enormous, enormous. I worried about every person I knew who might read it and imagined the worst that they would, come back to me with. And I coupled my writing journey, Gayatri, with a lot of time with my writing coach. So that was a meaningful support person, and a lot of time with a therapist, because I do believe that mental care, mental health care, is a meaningful part of how we show up for all of the versions of ourselves, the current author version, the past versions that are looking for, integration, all of those things. And in that year of writing and publishing this book, the one phrase that emerged over and over and over again for me, and it sounds a little bit callous, but it's not intended to be, is other people's opinions of me are not my business. And the reason that I say that that's not callous is because we live in a world that demands that we shape ourselves to be pleasing to other people so that other people don't react in ways that we might find scary. We're scared of what that reaction might be. And that fear is that ultimate editor. Don't tell your story this way, tell it this other way. Don't say this thing in this meeting, say it in this other way, because we are always trying to keep ourselves safe. The problem with that idea is twofold. One is that you cannot control other people's actions or reactions. And in fact, making yourself smaller or reshaping your voice or yourself is actually doing a disservice both to yourself and to the world around you. You're giving a smaller version of yourself. But it is actually also quite problematic because what the underlying assumption is that I can control other people. And there's quite a degree of, I don't mean to say the word as harsh as it is, but it is quite a manipulative thing to think that I as a person can control the actions and reactions and thoughts of another person, right? So the year of writing this book really also was coupled with me releasing any illusion of control that I might have on how other people view me, whether good or bad. Someone might think that I am, on this pedestal. I am that bio that you read. I am this paragon. That is just as false because I am a whole person that has all of the nuances of personhood. And on the flip side of that, if a person reads my story and villainizes me and sees me as less than and sees me as somebody that is unworthy of compassion or care and just a unidimensional character, that is just as false a narrative about who I am. And so, there's a beautiful podcast that I listen to. I love listening to podcasts because it really does give me an understanding of how other people are seeing the world. But this person said about authors that there are as many versions of you out in the world as people who have read your book. And so to think that I might be able to shape that or control that, even if it is somebody that loves me or is close to me or that whose opinion I hold dear, that feels like a foolish exercise. And then one last thing that I will say is that, when the feedback arrives that mirrors our fears or our worst sense of who we are or our worst insecurities, they feel more real because they're echoing something that we are telling ourselves. But the truth is that our stories are just our stories. They are neither good nor bad. They are the meaning that we attach to them. And so if we can receive feedback from the place of what is it from here that I can take with me and what is it that I don't need to take with me because that is not part of my meaning making, that is part of somebody else's meaning making. And both those truths can coexist. I think that for me has been maybe the most profound healing journey over the last year as well.
Yeah, exactly. Both those truths can coexist. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the crux of vulnerability is what we're talking about, right? Is you actually don't have any control of how other people receive that. And that's okay. And I think that can feel like a really scary thing, which prevents people from putting their story out there, right? And you and I both work with people from marginalized communities who often feel like sometimes their stories can be used against them or their stories can be misconstrued. And the reality is that's not something that we control. Yet, that is still important to tell our stories because we have to be able to tell the counter narrative to the mainstream narrative that maybe aims to diminish our voices or devalue our voices. And so how do you still develop the confidence and that muscle to go ahead and put your voice out into the world while being open to however it lands for people, right?
Yeah, you've used one of my favorite words, muscle, and I couple that to use the phrase muscle memory, right? So the act of vulnerability is not a one and done. It's not like, I woke up today and now I'm vulnerable with everybody in every circumstance, every single day, all the time, right? We still understand that there's a lot of emotional intelligence moving through the world to meet in community, to meet in relationship. So, for example, the example that I always use is you can be your authentic self at all times, knowing how you exist with your values, who you are, all of those things. And that authentic self showing up appropriately for the situation at hand is probably the greatest gift you can give in your relationship to one another. So, what I mean by that is, if you are your authentic self at a board meeting, is going to look like a very different authentic self than you at a family dinner. Is going to look
Mhm.
as a very different authentic self that you as at the beach, right? Three different scenarios, three different situations that require you to show up differently, but just as authentically. And so, when I think about that muscle memory of vulnerability, what that requires is you taking that chance to show up authentically and recognizing that maybe some of the fears might have been over amplified in your own mind. But
Mm.
okay, I'm going to try a little bit. So maybe that means I want to be able to recognize that I wear a different style of clothing than most other people. So I'm going to show up to a function in an outfit that might not reflect what everybody else is wearing. So if I have a traditional sari, or if I have a traditional lehenga or what have you, I might want to show up to a gala event in not the formal ball gown, but in my traditional Indian dress.
Mhm.
That's a way in which to show your authenticity that is safe, it's authentic, it's appropriate to the occasion. Now, if I wore a sari to the beach, I might be a little bit warm. I might be a little bit uncomfortable. Not appropriate. It's just as authentic, right? But say, for example, I'm going to the beach and everybody is taking hamburgers and hot dogs. And I know that a childhood favorite for me was chutney and cheese sandwiches. Maybe I show up to the beach with my chutney and cheese sandwiches and I say to my friends, hey, this is something that I used to have as a kid on the beach. Would you like to share some? Authentic
Mhm.
and appropriate, right? And so in those ways, we have to cultivate moments of authenticity in appropriate ways that then allows us to extend the muscle memory of vulnerability, because vulnerability is, like I said, not a one and done. You actually have to make yourself a little bit uncomfortable every time because you're not sure if you're going to be met with rejection. So if, for example,
Mhm.
I show up to the beach with my chutney sandwiches and all my friends say to me, ew, Roselle, take the chutney sandwiches away, we hate coriander, that's going to hurt my heart. That's going to make me feel like I never want to try being vulnerable again. So, in order for me to get to the beach with my 10 friends, maybe I say to my trusted friend or my spouse or my partner or someone super close to me, one person, hey, I really want to take these chutney sandwiches. Do you like them? Do you think that they will be well received? And finding those trusted partners, voices, and reflectors to give you that safe space to be vulnerable so you can test that vulnerability, test that safety. So then you say, okay, then you send out the message, hey team, I'm going to bring in chutney sandwiches. Any allergies or food restrictions, these are the
Mm.
ingredients. And then they say, oh no, I'd love to try this. I'm excited. Somebody might say, oh, I'm not a big fan of cilantro, but the rest of you go ahead, right? That gives you the opportunity then to test that vulnerability even more, to expand that safety zone over time. And utilizing that muscle memory over and over again in different situations is going to create for us then a trust in our own ability to be vulnerable, be authentic, but also to maintain our psychological safety, because that's so paramount.
Mm. Oh, there's so many things that you said I want to unpack, Roselle. Uh, where do we even start? I mean, I love the example of the chutney sandwich because that is sort of in a sense taking small steps, right? Asking someone instead of just showing up at the beach and presenting that and then feeling rejected if it's not well received, but asking someone close to you, how do you think this might be received? And then taking that next step to share it maybe with just a close few people or share it in advance and say, I'm bringing this to the meeting. Does anybody have allergies? I love that because I think there might be a situation where people fear, am I too vulnerable? and just maybe are not quite sure how to discern where that too vulnerable is for them, right? Because oftentimes a lot of, you know, I'm going to say trauma of things that have happened for people in their past was rejection, right? Where they tried to show up in their authentic self and were rejected. And that fear of relational loss is exactly that attachment piece that we get stuck with, right? Because when there's a trade-off between attachment and authenticity, we can show up as our authentic selves, but there's that risk that you may have attachment loss. And that fear is very real. So how do you build up that muscle again in small, small ways to get to that place where you can take that risk and it feels uncomfortable. If it feels uncomfortable, it's probably a good thing. You're growing your muscle and then continue to be vulnerable without sort of feeling like you just jumped off the deep end.
You got it. And I love that you use trauma-informed language because we are a culmination of all of our experiences, right? So if we've experienced that rejection in the past, it's going to make us more scared about a future prospect. We're going to be a little bit more protective, a little bit more guarded. And so creating for yourself that muscle memory of vulnerability. And also, I think that trauma or wounds, hurts, and harms have often created for us our own internalized narratives of what things mean, right? All of us are running with this tape player of, like a Morgan Freeman narrativizing our life story in the background. And sometimes we have to stop and ask ourselves, well, if I brought chutney sandwiches to the beach picnic when I was 15 years old and all my friends said, ew, I don't want to eat this, does that actually mean that if I bring it to this picnic that I'm going to be just as rejected? Or can I be curious about where my meaning has landed? Can I be curious about what I expect from the world around me? Because sometimes we actually impose our perception onto the world because of our past experiences. All of our experiences create for us those lenses, and those lenses are there to protect us. They're trying to protect us. But every so often, we realize that those lenses are maybe no longer to our benefit. They are perhaps holding us back from good relationships, and they are perhaps holding us in an attachment style that is no longer serving us, right? It might have at one point, but it's no longer serving us. And so, keeping an open heart to recognizing that our wounds have in fact shaped how we see the world, and they don't have to limit how we engage with the world moving forward. They are signals for us to pay attention to. They shouldn't be in the driver's seat.
Absolutely. And that disentanglement process, I think, is super hard, right? To be able to spot in the moment of when you're having maybe a strong reaction or activation to a situation to know, hey, wait a minute, am I actually just responding from the here and now? Or is there a past history that is sort of triggering me to behave in this way? And to your point earlier, that self-reflection is, I think, the key, right? To be able to look at our stories and look at those past experiences and make those connections, which, by the way, I think you've done so beautifully in your book. And I was just like, man, the level of awareness that this woman has. Oh my goodness. I think there's so much wisdom in there that people can learn from.
Well, thank you. I'll point to one phrase that I use in the book, and I love this because I keep reminding myself of it. It's this idea that if we do not take the time to heal, we will bleed all over people who didn't cut us. And, in trauma work, because I have worked in the social service sector, doing trauma-informed care, doing trauma-informed work, what I have known to be true especially also in the decade of work that I've done in the inclusion space, is that those of us that have experienced marginalization, those of us that have experienced trauma and hurt and wounds, will often, in those first few attempts of being vulnerable, overexpose our wounds in a way that makes us feel overexposed. It makes us feel, not great. Like I've overshared and I'm embarrassed and I'm anxious about it. But it actually also slimes the other person. It also slimes the people
Mm.
that we're sharing that with, because that's not appropriate, right? So oversharing without the recognition of what is appropriate and what is needed in a situation can actually create this idea of sliming people with our wounds.
Mhm.
And that's why I go back to having a why for why you want to share your story. So, when I wrote the words in the stream of consciousness, the reason for it was that I just want to get it out. I want to get all of it out onto the paper. I wasn't editing myself as I was going along, because that's helpful to actually not have that editor there. But now I want to put this book out into the world. Now I want to share it with people. How do I balance my desire to tell my story while not overexposing myself, not creating a sense of anxiety or oversharing, not sliming people with an overindulgence of my wounds or my traumas or my harms if they're not fulfilling a purpose, right? And so that's the distinction, I think, between when you write versus when you share. What is a journal entry versus what is going to go into a book or an anthology or onto the internet? There has to be intentionality behind why we do the things in the way that we do them.
Absolutely. Oh, and even on that point, Roselle, I work with a lot of leaders in particular who are very interested in sharing their story, and not just from sort of a PR perspective, but to truly convey what it is about inclusion work or the work that they're doing that they care about. Why is that important to them? How are their values actually showing up in action? And those are some of the types of stories that I get to work with leaders. But what I find is that point of distinction of what's a journal entry versus what actually goes on my intranet, my company intranet, or on a podcast or in a book or a keynote, that becomes that place of discernment, right? Is how do you do that? And I think what I'm hearing you say is actually there could be a thing where there's too much vulnerability. I don't even know if there too much vulnerability is the right word, but oversharing and not wanting to slime people that way, right? So it's just a muscle like anything else.
Yeah, you bet. It's just a muscle. And the great gift of storytelling is that it gives you the time and space internally to slow down and start getting curious with yourself of, whom am I sharing this for? Am I sharing this because it's going to make me feel like, okay, I've unloaded and now I can walk away? Or am I sharing this for the greater good or the benefit of the relationship that is in front of me with the person whom I'm sharing it with? And I think creating that space through the practice of storytelling, through the practice of, articulating your voice is one of the greater gifts that comes from this process.
Absolutely. And on that note, Roselle, I have bookmarked another line or paragraph from your story that I would love to read out if you're open to it.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
and I think it just goes right back to what we were talking about, which is the fear of being disliked is a deeply uncomfortable one. If one is disliked, then it must mean that one is unlikable. The fallacy is so deeply entrenched in our relationality that we've created an entire way of being in the world that demands that we contort ourselves into the tiniest pretzel version of ourselves, digestible morsels of personality, never inconveniencing the world around us. I want the people around me to impact me with their fullness, their authenticity, their big ideas, and enormous passionate emotions. I believe we're big enough to hold space for each other's fullness. Oh, that just touched me deep. So,
It's one of my core beliefs that we are doing a disservice to ourselves, to one another, to our good relationships, to pretend to be anything smaller or less than we actually are. Um, there is a difference between discernment. So I'm not going to say this right now because it's not going to serve a greater purpose. And I'm not going to say this right now because I don't think they're going to like me as much if I say it. Right. And so discernment is different from making yourself more palatable, making yourself smaller, making yourself pretend to fit in. And I say pretend to fit in because at the heart of being human is our very real need to feel a sense of belonging within a community, within a group of people. We are not meant to be in isolation from one another. We are meant to be in community with one another. And if we are to truly be in community with one another, not just a version of ourselves, we must be willing to do that uncomfortable thing of exploration of what that authenticity means. But what we've actually created now is this idea that if I wear the right shoes and have the right jean shape and drink the right drink water bottle, the latest water bottle fad, and put the right pictures up on Instagram, then I will quote unquote fit in. I'll be part of something greater than myself, which is so human. We want to belong, but the how we've gone towards creating that sense of belonging is to everybody become smaller than who they really are. And everybody's fitting into a box that was not made for them. And my goodness, what have we robbed from ourselves because of that? What if we all showed up in this absolute vibrance of color and noise and expression that really allowed us to be in the full manifestation of humanity? Because that then is a powerful way for us to hold space for the fact that I'm allowed to be different and I'm allowed to still belong. We've currently created a society in which, because I am different, I cannot belong, or in order for me to belong, I must be the same. And that is a disservice. Today I was in a yoga class this morning, and part of my yoga practice over the last 20 years has been to always create space for myself to recognize that chattering comparison mind of the persons beside me are not moving their bodies in the same way as me, or that we don't all look the same, or not wearing all the same things, is not actually when I first started my yoga practice 20 years ago, it was a point of, oh my goodness, I need to learn how to move in the same way and I need to wear the same types of clothing. And 20 years on, what I know to be true is today I came to my mat and I thought, how beautiful that every single one of the people here is moving their bodies in the way that honors who they are and where they are today. How beautiful it is that we are able to show up and be in community, even though we are not doing the same things with our bodies, wearing the same clothes in our bodies, but that we are able to hold space where all of us fit and all of us belong, even because of, not in spite of, our differences.
Mm, I love that. So well put. And that is, in my opinion, too, that sense of true belonging comes from not having to conform to be the same, but also not feeling excluded because you're different, right? The differences are actually valued in a way that you can it's almost like you're fluid, right? You can come into a space and you can share things in common, but you can also stand out for yourself, and that's truly valued. And I think that's where a sense of belonging comes from. And so, Roselle, before we sort of close off, because I feel like I could keep talking to you for hours, I want to ask you two other things. One just being, how can people find you? How can they find your book? Um, how can they reach out, or if you want to share anything, that kind of closing comments that comes to mind for people?
Yeah, absolutely. So my book is called The Ordinary Turned Precious. It's available on all Amazon marketplaces. So in Canada, the global site, the United States, the UK. I'm so proud that it's available in India, the land of my birth, Australia. So wherever you are, there's a few markets that have not yet received copies. And so I would just go to the .com site if that's where you are in the world. So that's the book. You can find out more about me. I'm terrible at social media, but I do like LinkedIn because it's a professional, landing spot. And I have a terribly attended to Instagram page. It's RM Gonsalves on Instagram. I post just what happens in my daily life. So nothing massive or meaningful to my broader work. And then, my website, rmgonsalves.com, tells you a little bit more about who I am, my values, some of the work that I do, and holds a portfolio of some of the work that I've done and hopefully intend to do over the next while as well.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So one last question for you, Roselle. And
Yes.
this is something that I get all my guests to share because, as you know, this podcast is about belonging and storytelling. And so, would you be open to completing the sentence, which is, I feel a sense of belonging when?
Hmm. I feel a sense of belonging when I am in good company, that I can make a corny joke that allows me to dance and make voices, because that's at the heart of who I am, is humor and silliness and fun. And what I have found is that the spaces in which I feel the most relaxed, belonged, safe, and myself are the places where my most mischievous, curious, childlike version is safe to emerge. And it's usually in the form of some kind of hilarious joke, or sometimes it's only me that thinks it's hilarious, the form of some dance, the form of some song. And that to me is a sign that my whole system, my whole being feels like I am where I need to be.
Ah, I love that. As you were sharing that, I could just kind of picture you at the beach and just cracking a joke with the chutney sandwich. And isn't that the truth, right? To just be yourself and find belonging.
And
Roselle,
it's funny, Gayatri. I will say that that person, that version of me, the joy-filled, mischievous, childlike version shows up everywhere. It shows up in work meetings. I'm not saying I'm singing my way through work meetings, but in the best work meetings, we have the opportunity to be curious, engaged. And so when I say this, I truly mean that it shows up in every avenue of my being, my work, my life, etc. Thank you for having me on, Gayatri.
thank you, Roselle. You've shared so much wisdom in just a short time, and I truly mean this. I've been impacted by your book, and I hope that it reaches so many more people. And I'm so sure that it will allow them to see themselves reflected too. So thank you for all the work that you do, and thank you for coming on Hearth to Heart.